At a high-level mining summit in Kinshasa, a sharp accusation echoed through the marble hall. "You sold your people for foreign bullets." The words came from 36-year-old Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, aimed directly at Congolese leader Tsh.ise.ke.di. Cameras flashed, diplomats froze. Tsh.ise.ke.di, stunned, called it defamation and threatened legal action for slander. But Traoré wasn't done. He raised a document labeled Confidential Mercenary Deployment Authorization. The room gasped. What had started as a disagreement over security had just turned into a public exposure of betrayal. Africa watched in silence as two presidents prepared for a battle far deeper than politics. If you believe in truth, justice, and a new future for Africa, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories about Ibrahim Traoré and the fight for real independence. Every click helps amplify the voice of a movement that refuses to be silenced. Stand with us, stay informed, stay fearless. At first, many believed it was a diplomatic misunderstanding. During the mining summit in Kinshasa, Tsh.ise.ke.di interpreted Ibrahim Traoré's bold accusation as a personal attack rather than a political concern. Traoré had stood before dozens of African leaders and foreign observers and accused the Congolese government of selling their sovereignty for the protection of foreign guns. Tsh.ise.ke.di immediately deemed the statement defamatory, calling it a reckless insult to the dignity of the Congolese state. His legal advisors whispered about taking formal action against Traoré for slander, possibly even expelling Burkina Faso's delegation from the summit. The tension was electric, and most assumed the young leader had gone too far. But Traoré wasn't finished. As the room simmered with anxiety, he calmly unfolded a thick document stamped confidential. It was a copy of a signed authorization detailing the deployment of a private military contractor, one with a long history of human rights violations across conflict zones in the Middle East and Central America. The authorization bore official government seals. The room fell silent. What began as an accusation now carried undeniable weight. It was no longer a question of rhetoric, it was a matter of evidence. The supposed defamation now looked like exposure. Despite Tsh.ise.ke.di's repeated claims that the contractors were only stationed to protect infrastructure and deter rebel groups, Traoré pushed further. He revealed that in the past 3 months alone, satellite data had shown increased military activity in cobalt-rich regions where local villagers had mysteriously disappeared. Reports had surfaced, mostly dismissed as rumor of armed men in unmarked uniforms, forcing entire communities to evacuate. Traoré framed these events not as isolated incidents, but as symptoms of a deeper betrayal. "This is not about Congo alone," he said. "This is about the soul of Africa. When our minerals are guarded by strangers with guns, we are not free." Tsh.ise.ke.di's face hardened. He reiterated that Burkina Faso had no jurisdiction in Congolese affairs, and accused Traoré of grandstanding to score political points. But among the audience, especially younger African diplomats, Traoré's words struck a chord. They weren't just hearing a young president accuse an older one. They were watching the collapse of a mask. The legal threat that once loomed over Traoré now felt like a hollow gesture, a failed attempt to suppress an uncomfortable truth. What started as an alleged insult had turned into a revelation. And in that moment it became clear to everyone in the room that the real issue wasn't about hurt pride or diplomatic etiquette. It was about power fear and the uncomfortable reality that some leaders were protecting wealth, not people. Traoré had done more than speak, he had lit a fuse, and no amount of legal threats could put out the fire now burning across the hall. Within 24 hours of the summit confrontation, the media across Africa and beyond exploded with headlines. Some outlets sided with Tsh.ise.ke.di, labeling Traoré's speech as reckless populism, while others began investigating the claims behind his shocking disclosure. In Ouagadougou, Traoré called an emergency press conference. Calm but firm, he announced the formation of an independent investigative mission composed of legal experts, journalists, and former military officers from neutral African states. Their task was clear: to verify whether private military contractors had been deployed unlawfully in the cobalt regions of Congo, and whether civilians had been harmed as a result. The investigative team, dubbed the Pan-African Sovereignty Commission, departed within days. They arrived first in Goma, then traveled discreetly to several mining zones, previously restricted to civilians and journalists. There they met locals who, at first hesitant, eventually shared harrowing stories. Entire villages had been displaced. Families spoke of mass soldiers who arrived without warning, forced them to evacuate and burn down huts to make way for security zones. Others described loved ones who had vanished after being questioned by the foreign troops. Children who wandered too close to mining fences never returned. These were not the tales of rebels or propaganda, they were the voices of survivors. The Commission's drone footage captured rows of makeshift barracks near mining fields, fortified with barbed wire and armed checkpoints. Some footage even showed helicopters bearing no national insignias, transporting unknown cargo. By the end of the second week, the Commission had collected hours of testimonies, hundreds of photos and satellite evidence that corroborated the scale of the militarization. But the most damning discovery came from a whistleblower, a Congolese soldier who claimed he was ordered to stand down and let the private contractors handle the population without interference. His voice, disguised and trembling, was recorded and shared confidentially with Traoré's office. When Traoré published the first findings, it was no longer possible to dismiss his warnings as political theater. His report, titled "Buried Beneath the Minerals." The price of foreign guns shook the African Union. It painted a bleak picture, not just of violence, but of silence and complicity. While some African leaders called for a formal investigation, others remained conspicuously quiet, avoiding comment. The Congolese government, in turn, declared the commission illegitimate and accused Traoré of waging an international smear campaign. But the public didn't stay quiet. Across social media platforms, millions shared the report. In Congo itself, protests erupted in Lubumbashi and Kinshasa. Young citizens, many of whom had never trusted their government, demanded answers. They carried placards with messages like, "We are not minerals and our land is not for sale." For them, Traoré was no longer just a foreign leader. He was the voice saying what their own leaders refused to admit. And for Tsh.ise.ke.di, the crisis had now grown beyond control. What began as a threat of legal retaliation had triggered a wave of exposure and accountability. As the firestorm of public outcry spread, pressure began mounting, not only on Tsh.ise.ke.di, but also on international entities with vested interests in Congo's mineral wealth. Foreign ambassadors, previously silent, were now being questioned by the press. Human rights organizations, some of which had long ignored Central Africa's plight, were forced to release statements acknowledging the seriousness of the allegations. Traoré's report had crossed a line. It had named names, exposed contracts, and revealed satellite-confirmed military operations that directly contradicted the Congolese government's denials. The once contained scandal had now become a continental reckoning. Despite the escalating controversy, President Tsh.ise.ke.di doubled down. He held a nationally televised address where he claimed that Traoré was being manipulated by anti-development forces and that the Pan-African Sovereignty Commission had fabricated evidence to serve an extremist narrative. However, rather than calming the situation, his words poured fuel on the flames. Viewers were outraged at his dismissive tone, especially in light of the first-hand testimonies from displaced families and the damning whistleblower audio that had already circulated across social media. Meanwhile, Traoré's strategy became even more calculated. Rather than responding emotionally, he convened a virtual summit with leaders from Mali, Guinea, and Chad nations, equally wary of foreign influence in their internal affairs. In a joint statement, the leaders called for an immediate suspension of private military activities in resource zones across Africa. The statement, titled "For the Soil and the People," emphasized African-led security, community inclusion, and transparency in resource governance. It was a direct challenge, not only to Tsh.ise.ke.di, but to any African government enabling foreign military presence without accountability. Inside Congo, dissent was no longer confined to the streets. Members of Tshisekedi's own administration began leaking documents, internal memos, and emails that hinted at long-standing deals between the Ministry of Mines and foreign security contractors. A leaked contract revealed a 12-year agreement signed secretly guaranteeing mineral protection in exchange for 20% of the extracted profits. The people, already angry, now felt betrayed. "We weren't just sold out," one Kinshasa protester shouted into a live broadcast. "We were auctioned off." What had started as a perceived insult by Traore was now snowballing into institutional collapse. Public trust in Tshisekedi's leadership plummeted. Several lawmakers defected to opposition parties, calling for an independent investigation and demanding that Congo withdraw all foreign troops from its mining regions. Traore had not merely revealed a truth, he had destabilized a falsehood that had been propped up for years by silence, fear, and international greed. And in doing so, he reignited a broader question across the continent: who really owns Africa's land, its people, and its future? The storm intensified when an internal memo from the Congolese Ministry of Defense was leaked to the international press. The document outlined coordination plans between Congolese forces and a Western private military group, including orders to neutralize resistance in specific cobalt-rich villages. The memo, marked as top secret, directly contradicted Tshisekedi's repeated claims that the government had no official ties to foreign paramilitary contractors. The revelation sent shockwaves across African diplomatic circles. What had once been framed as defamation by Traore was now looking more like a heroic act of whistleblowing. In the streets of Kinshasa, the demonstrations grew louder. What started as student marches had turned into nationwide unrest. Protesters carried banners with Traore's face alongside the slogan, "He told us the truth they buried." Congolese citizens who had once viewed the Burkina leader as a distant radical now saw him as a symbol of courage. Meanwhile, inside the Congolese parliament, tensions rose. Opposition MPs demanded a no-confidence vote, while ministers close to Tshisekedi scrambled to defend a collapsing narrative. Some even attempted to blame lower-ranking officials for signing the contracts without presidential approval, an excuse the public no longer accepted. Across the continent, African youth movements organized solidarity rallies. In Lagos, Bamako, and Dakar, crowds gathered to chant against militarized mining and foreign control. Social media exploded with testimonials from Congolese citizens who had long felt ignored and voiceless. Hashtags like #Cobalt Kills and African Lives Matter surged to the top of trending lists. Ibrahim Traoré's speeches were shared and translated into multiple languages, becoming a rallying cry for a new kind of African leadership, one rooted not in diplomacy or wealth, but in truth and accountability. Faced with mounting international scrutiny, Tsh.ise.ke.di appealed to the African Union to intervene diplomatically. He claimed that Burkina Faso had violated Congo's sovereignty and was inciting rebellion. But many AU members hesitated to support him. Traoré, ever composed, responded in an official statement, "Truth is not a weapon, it is a mirror. If your house trembles when it's revealed, the problem is not the mirror." His words were quoted everywhere, from television broadcasts to protest graffiti. What was once a regional scandal had transformed into a continental debate about leadership legitimacy and the role of foreign interests in Africa's most valuable industries. As the scandal deepened, former allies of Tsh.ise.ke.di began quietly distancing themselves. International donors paused their programs. Western media, initially skeptical of Traoré's allegations, began publishing investigative reports that further validated his claims. In a matter of weeks, the balance of moral authority had shifted. Traoré, once accused of slander, now stood as the unyielding force that dared to tell a dangerous truth, and in doing so he exposed not only a policy failure, but a rot that had festered under layers of politics, fear, and silence. In a final desperate move to reclaim control of the narrative, President Tsh.ise.ke.di announced a national commission to investigate the allegations against his administration. But the public no longer trusted internal reviews, especially ones hand-picked by the same officials accused of wrongdoing. The commission was immediately seen as a smokescreen, a symbolic gesture with no real intent to uncover the truth. Meanwhile, Traore continued to release more evidence through independent African media channels, including anonymous testimonies from displaced Congolese families, GPS logs of mercenary troop movements, and satellite images of scorched villages previously inhabited by mining communities. Traore's leadership style stood in stark contrast to the calculated evasions of his Congolese counterpart. Where Tsh.ise.ke.di offered scripted statements behind guarded podiums, Traore spoke plainly often in open-air forums surrounded by citizens. He used these moments not to boast, but to warn. What is happening in Congo today could happen to any of us tomorrow. If we are not brave now, our children will grow up under hired guns and foreign flags. His words resonated not only with activists, but also with disillusioned diplomats, religious leaders, and former skeptics across the continent. As protests in Kinshasa turned violent with clashes between demonstrators and government forces, the military's response became more brutal. International observers began documenting the excessive use of force. Tear gas, rubber bullets, and even live ammunition were used against unarmed crowds. Yet the more the government tried to suppress dissent, the more it inflamed it. Images of injured children and grieving mothers filled the airwaves. Instead of weakening Traore's influence, the chaos only amplified his moral authority. He became the symbol of what African leadership could look like when it refused to be silent in the face of injustice. The pressure eventually cracked the regime's inner circle. A high-ranking military commander publicly resigned, stating he could no longer participate in operations that protect minerals more than people. His televised statement went viral and sparked resignations across lower administrative ranks. Foreign embassies in Kinshasa began quietly evacuating staff fearing political collapse. Tsh.ise.ke.di's once unshakable hold on power now trembled under the weight of exposure and public fury. At an extraordinary African Union session held in Addis Ababa, Traore stood before a silent chamber of heads of state and delivered a closing speech that would define a generation. This is not about Congo. This is about all of us. If truth is dangerous, then silence is fatal. The room remained quiet, but the shift was undeniable. Traore had gone from being labeled an agitator to becoming the conscience of a continent. And though Tsh.ise.ke.di still clung to power, his legacy had been rewritten, not by political enemies, but by the voice of a leader who chose truth over fear and justice over silence. In the heart of modern Africa, amidst the roaring ambitions and buried scars of colonial history, this confrontation between Ibrahim Traoré and Félix Tsh.ise.ke.di delivers one of the most sobering and necessary lessons of our time. It reminds us that the fight for sovereignty is no longer fought with flags and front lines. It is fought with information accountability and the courage to speak when silence is more profitable. The lesson is not about one president outshining another. It is about the price of truth in a world still dominated by shadows. One of the most powerful lessons from this crisis is that truth is dangerous to those who benefit from silence. Tsh.ise.ke.di's initial attempt to discredit Traoré relied on the assumption that the young Burkina leader's voice would be dismissed as radical or uninformed. But truth, when backed by evidence, has a power that transcends age, title, or diplomacy. Traoré understood that exposing injustice was not about gaining popularity. It was about restoring the dignity of people who had long been erased from national conversations. Another key lesson lies in the danger of unchecked leadership. When governments operate without transparency, without accountability to their citizens, they become vulnerable to corruption and foreign manipulation. Tsh.ise.ke.di's administration prioritized profits and power over people's safety and sovereignty. In doing so, it invited not just scrutiny, but collapse. Leadership is not about holding a position, it's about serving a people. Traoré's actions underscored that true leadership means choosing the harder path standing up even when the consequences are immense. This story also reveals how the perception of slander can be used as a weapon to silence dissent. Tsh.ise.ke.di initially framed Traoré's accusations as defamatory, threatening legal action. But what began as an effort to protect his image eventually exposed deeper truths he had hoped to keep buried. The misuse of legal threats to suppress political criticism is a tactic not unique to Congo. It's a global danger. But in this case, the attempt to bury truth only fertilized its growth. The louder Tsh.ise.ke.di condemned the claims, the more people began to ask, what is he hiding? Perhaps the most urgent lesson is the power of grassroots mobilization and collective awakening. It wasn't just Traoré's voice that made the difference. It was the reaction of the people. Protesters, whistleblowers, journalists, and citizens across Africa joined in amplifying the message. When injustice is exposed, people will rise, but only if they are given something real to believe in. The authenticity of Traoré's leadership combined with undeniable evidence inspired action beyond borders. The lesson here is that unity in truth is stronger than any regime built on fear. The crisis also serves as a case study in how foreign influence continues to haunt African politics, not always through direct invasion, but through private contracts, militarized resource zones, and silent complicity. The presence of foreign mercenaries in Congo's mining regions is a symptom of a larger illness, the commodification of African land and lives. Traoré's refusal to accept this reality quietly forced the continent to confront a question it has long avoided: who really controls the wealth beneath African soil? Moreover, the unfolding events teach us that whistleblowing and independent investigation are essential tools of democracy, especially in systems where state-controlled media and government-aligned commissions often whitewash the truth. By establishing a commission outside of traditional diplomatic frameworks, Traoré not only protected the credibility of the findings, but also gave a blueprint for how future leaders can pursue justice without waiting for international permission. Lastly, this story reminds us that the legacy of a leader is not shaped by their years in office, but by the impact of their truth. Felix Tsh.ise.ke.di may remain in power for now, but the narrative has shifted. His authority is stained by secrecy and violence. In contrast, Ibrahim Traoré, though younger and leading a smaller nation, now represents a new wave of leadership that values integrity over image. His courage to confront not only a fellow president, but a system of exploitation makes him a symbol of what Africa could become if led by those who refuse to remain silent. In the end, the most enduring lesson is this: justice begins when one person chooses to break the silence. And sometimes that one voice, when echoed by the people, can unravel years of lies, awaken a generation, and ignite a revolution not of weapons but of truth.